Everyone. Good evening. It's great to see you all here and be with you here tonight at the beautiful Impact Hub here in Oakland, California. My name is Catherine Huffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Square One Project, and it is my great privilege to join my many colleagues and friends, new and old, in an evening with all of you all, and with our most special honored guests, Marlon Peterson and Alicia Garza, who I will invite, who are wrestling with their microphones at the moment, who I'll ask to come ahead and come on up to the stage here, and we'll go ahead and get started in just a second. While they're doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Square One Project for those who may not yet be familiar. The Square One Project is a 3-year undertaking where we are gathering some of the greatest, oh wow, you guys are brave, that was good, go ahead. Make yourselves comfortable. Where we are gathering some of the great thinkers and imaginers and workers and experts of our time, people with a huge diverse range of experience and expertise, to help us think about what would happen if we put aside everything we know about the justice system and we think about how we might respond to problems of violence, problems of poverty, problems of racism in a whole new way. What would that system look like? How would we respond? Would it look anything like what we do right now and what we use right now to try to grapple with these problems in our country? That's our undertaking, and we're here in Oakland for a 3-day convening of our public roundtable on the future of justice policy. We've spent the last day and a half digging in on the questions of what are we going to do about overcriminalization? What is punitive excess? What's happening in our courts? And how might that all look different in this conversation about thinking about Square One and about a whole new way of approaching these problems? We are very honored tonight to have 2 of those great thinkers that I was mentioning before joining us on stage for, yeah, look at Marlon. Joining us on stage to have a conversation about this, and it's really just an honor and a pleasure. Marlon Peterson is the host of the Decarcerated podcast and really one of the incredible contributors to this work so far. He was with us at our first roundtable, which took place in Durham, North Carolina, and has continued to join us here in Oakland. Alicia Garza needs no introduction, especially in Oakland, I'm guessing, but is, again, one of the great leaders of the new civil and human rights movement that is sweeping our country and that is really taking us in a whole new way, and that is one of the leading lights in this conversation that we're having about our justice system. So thank you to both of you all for being here. We're going to be lucky enough to watch and listen in on your conversation for a little while, and then we will plan to open up for some questions and conversation with the audience after that. So over to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So are you ready?
Let's do it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marlon Peterson. I get to sit on stage with Ms. Alicia Garza. Give her a round of applause, please. So we have some big bucket topics we want to address, right? So we're speaking about Square One. How can we reimagine justice? We had the opportunity to start from Square One, right? And one of the participants in the roundtable here in Oakland, Jeff, was, I forget his last name, Jeff Ward, I'm sorry. Are you here, Jeff? I'm sorry for butchering. Hey. He wrote a paper, and one of the things in the paper, he questioned whether Square One is possible. Like, could we even start from Square One? So you're Oakland native, so this is your home.
Okay, wait,
oh.
I'm sensitive about
okay,
this.
Okay.
I'm not an Oakland native.
Okay.
I've been here for 20 years, but I'm not an Oakland native. I'm a proud Oakland resident.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And I'm born and raised in the Bay.
Okay.
Just saying.
Okay.
People
Okay.
get funny about that. Real Oaklanders are like, no, you're not from here.
Okay. I'm from Brooklyn, so I get it.
You understand. You gotta pay respect.
So we're in the Bay, where you're at now. I mean, where you reside for 20 years. You have a foothold here. You have a foundation here. We're here at the Impact Hub. First question I think we can start off with is, just off the top, we're dreamers, right? We're dreamers. Is this dreaming about what, from square one, how can we reimagine justice? If we're dreaming, one, do we have, this is a provocative one, but I think you answer, do we have the tools to do that, first of all?
No, not yet.
Tell me more.
Well, I want to start with the question that you asked earlier, which is it possible to start from square one?
Okay.
And yes and no. I want to say it that way. So I think that the challenge that we're facing right now is that we are trying to dismantle something and build something new inside of a context that doesn't support it. And even though before Black Lives Matter and all of that, people have been doing this work for so long, right? But it's still not a mandate. And even though everybody's talking about mass incarceration, everybody's talking about some version of decarceration, our culture at large does not support many of the things that we are talking about in these rooms. And that's part of our work, right, is to get people to try and support that. But it creates an additional challenge for trying to build something new inside of a context that doesn't support it. So let me back up a couple steps. For me, when I think about social change and how change happens, my assumption is always that change is a process, and there's no destination that you get to where everything's all good, right? Once you get to a point, there's new things that are being opened up, new questions, new challenges, new opportunities, and you're having to grapple with that. But inside of a nation, and I'll just kind of situate us in the US, inside of a nation that has built itself off of punishment, that has built itself off of extracting labor in any possible way that it can, extracting value in any possible way that it can, and adapting the forms by which we extract and prey upon people. Those things are even inherent in our movements. That extraction, that predatory nature, we bring that into our change work. And so if we're not looking at how do we dismantle our own habits around extraction and preying upon as we are trying to build something new, what we end up doing is building something that is adapting to the conditions of exploitation and extraction and predatoriness, right? And we're not actually changing the dynamics of power. So that's the thing I worry about. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. And so when I say that yes and no, yes, I think it is possible to start from square one, but no also because the context that we're in doesn't support that, and so it requires us to be different. And so when you talk about do we have the tools then to be able to start from square one, I think the first set of tools that we need are the tools to be more conscious of our own behaviors in the free space that we're trying to create to build something new.
So does that go along with something I've been thinking about is before we, like what does justice look like for us as individuals, like internally? So one of the things when we opened up yesterday at the round table, and the question was, like what would you want to get out of this, or what do you want to bring to this conversation over the next 3 days? I had said, well, I'm in the honesty business. So I want us to have honest conversations. Yeah. So is a part of the problem is that we're not having honest enough conversations?
Yes.
Because here's the thing, right? Walk with me and be conscious that we decide that we're going to talk to each other, how we want to talk to each other, and you get to kind of be a part of that. So there's this idea of well, Brooklyn and the Oak and the Bay get together. There's a particular confine from which we operate out of, right? So I spoke about earlier today, we brought the conversation around whiteness and white supremacy, et cetera. So we think about these big bucket issues of criminalization, punitiveness, and now, well, let's stick with those two first. So are you saying that we are literally just creating, what we're creating is within that confines of that whole ideology?
Yes, so when I talk about extraction, when I talk about exploitation, when I talk about being predatory, all of those things are tools of control. They're social control, they're economic control, they're political control. And if we're gonna have an honest conversation, right, the whole system of incarcerating people, human beings, putting human beings in cement and steel cages, is not designed to solve problems in the way that we say it is. It's designed to control behavior and to control populations that we want to manipulate to do a thing. So if you look at the history of how this country was built, there's different mechanisms by which populations are controlled, whether that be women, whether that be poor people, whether that be black folk, whether that be indigenous folk, whether that be labor that was brought from China and other places, right? All of that had a network of policies and laws and practices that defined what people could do and couldn't do, who people could be and couldn't be. And when you go outside of the boundaries of that, right, then that's where punishment comes in, because it's meant to discourage you from particular behaviors or particular ways of being, yeah? So for me, when we talk about having honest conversations, and when I was saying that we bring some of those dynamics into our movements, there's a lot that I can point to. So it's weird being me, and I'm sure it's weird being you, right? What's weird for me about being me, and I want to hear from you, what's weird for you about being you? What's weird for me about being me is that at this stage in my life, I'm often unclear why people are inviting me to particular places, right? So, and just to be fully honest about it, sometimes it's because people care about what I think, but a lot of times it's because people care about what I represent in a place, yeah? And if we're being honest about that, that's extractive.
For sure,
right?
For sure.
And it doesn't mean that when I come to a place where the intention may have been to have me act as a magnet, that there's not good things that come out of that. But it is to say that even in the course of our best work, we are not always conscious of the ways in which we extract, exploit, or use other mechanisms of control. I'll give another example. I have conversations all over the country with people about Black Lives Matter, and often the conversation is about what Black Lives Matter is not. And when people will say things to me like, I love your movement. You guys are just so brave, and you're out here, and you're really just, I'm inspired and I'm moved by your movement, right? But, and there's always a but, I wish you guys were more nonviolent. I wish you were more open to allies. This is how people talk about whiteness, allies, right? I wish you all would not talk so much about the queer thing, or right? And then another way that it plays out is that, you know, I can be somebody who popped off at the mouth about something on a social media platform that then people took up and did stuff with, right? That's dope. But why is it that I can have spent 6 years building a thing, getting knocked upside the head about a thing, you know, going through trials and tribulations with my people inside of a thing, going through trials and tribulations with people who are not inside of my thing, and still to this day, people are still looking for the person who's more palatable to represent the thing that I built. What's that about? So, I mean, I'm curious to hear from your perspective how that plays out, because to be frank, the point of me saying this is not to, and again, we should break this down, right? Because what comes up for me when I say that is, oh, maybe I'm being ungrateful. Then I'm like, ungrateful for what? So there's all these different layers to how even in the most justice intentioned spaces, right? If we're not paying attention, and not in an angsty way, like I'm afraid to do anything, but in a way that's like, am I really showing up and practicing my own principles? I don't think that we can, that to me is what it means to start from square one. To actually interrogate, even in the places where we are scheming on how we get freer, and we'll talk more about that, right? Are we really interrogating the ways that we show up, and are we matching the values that we are trying to bring into being? Are we bringing those into being right now, and are we conscious of bringing those into being all the time? Where are the places that we take shortcuts? Where are the places that we say, okay, I know I'm about justice, but I really just need to have this thing so that this thing can happen, right? What are the consequences of our shortcuts? And how does that impact whether or not we can start from square one? I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think, we were speaking about this a couple minutes ago, about our value in the places that we're invited to. And so for folks who don't know, I did a bunch of time in prison in New York State. And, just to be 10 years since I've been home, I've been able to do, contribute to some things that I can be proud of, but also some things I know we still need to do better. So I also question sometimes, like, why am I invited to places? Like, what is the currency of my being, right? Is it, of course people, I have ideas, I think, well, I've contributed, I've written, I've spoken, I've done all that sort of stuff, I've created programs, et cetera, but there's also that part that makes me think, what else about me that brings me here? Am I that, that prize you get to show off, that this person, this model of what evolution looks like? Somebody who was formerly incarcerated, his rags to riches story, even though the riches, I'm using that very vaguely.
We'll come back to that.
Using that very, but yeah, I think that's why I brought up the idea of like that gaze. Because I think there's always for those of us in the space, whether it be because we're black, whether because we're queer, whether because we're formerly incarcerated, like there's a question of, am I here because of that part of my identity? And that's not it's a question that we struggle with, but I also think it's a question for those who organize anything need to be struggling with, to really interrogate. So I said, like, what does justice look like for ourselves? Folks need to be thinking about that for themselves too. Because in so many ways, we think about square one, we're literally reproducing the same old thing over and over again. I got this free-ish Negro now, look what he can do. And this whole idea of free-ish and freeness, I know you say you wanted to get to that. So I did a bunch of time, and you have worked around issues of mass incarceration, police violence, gender and queer equity for years, even before Black Lives Matter became the thing, right? The thing that everybody says now, right? The bumper sticker. I'm sort of wondering, like, do you feel that people truly understand the motivations behind the work that you've done? So we think about the work you've done around domestic workers. That's really the basis for where you came to Black Lives Matter, actually. Do you think people get it? Because I don't know now. I see how we speak about immigration in this country to this day, and it doesn't seem like it.
No, people don't. I mean, if you know me from here, and there's folks who do, where are you at, Eddie? Eddie here?
Eddie Zhang in the building.
Eddie?
Yeah.
And there's other folks here we've been working together since before Black Lives Matter, and even, before Hurricane Katrina and beyond that, right? But to be honest, people don't ask. People don't ask, which is why they don't know. So we do a lot of talking, all over the place. And I'm struck by how no matter how many times I tell the story, the number one question I get, and this is again about shortcuts, how do you turn a hashtag into a movement? I have this idea for a hashtag, and basically I want you to tell me how to get it to take off. Like your stuff took off. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way. I don't even know how we got here, right? Social media is not an inherent thing for me, right? I didn't even know what a hashtag was. And I offer that conversation because I think so much of how we understand change is the flashy things. And it struck me that when you talked about, what are our motivations for doing this work? And then you joked earlier about, the rags to riches story. I think there's layers to that, to be honest, because you're not rich and I'm not rich, but we do each have a level of access that we did not have before. And it does make you pause to keep asking yourself over and over to reconnect to why you're doing this work. Again, we live in a capitalist society where what is valued above everything else is celebrity and value, our value to others. And then when we start talking about Black folks in particular, Black people as creators, Black people as innovators, Black people as that get positioned as like the moral compass of this nation, which drives me nuts, by the way.
I don't know where that compass is at right now.
It's even worse, right? Because on some level, even in movements, we become commodities. Even inside of movements, we become commodities. So I think people don't ask most of the time, where did you come from? Who are your people? Like Ella Baker used to say, right? Who are your people? If you ask me who my people are, I could tell you, and you would be like, oh, who are those people? And who are they connected to? What's the story there? The story is, I first started organizing on the streets of East and West Oakland. I was organizing around gentrification. I was organizing around economic justice. I learned how to door knock in deep East Oakland. I had doors slammed in my face, right? I had people tell me to go away. I had people tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. And it was all shaping and formative for me. I spent 10 years working in Bayview Hunters Point, fighting corporate-led gentrification, which is a big fancy word for what happens when you sell people's communities, right? But in this case, what they were doing and what they're still doing, if we're gonna have an honest conversation, is trying to use the culture of the community to sell the community. So we would have these conversations, we would go into these meetings where they would say, no, we're gonna bring in amenities into the community, like a Jamba Juice or a Starbucks, but they're gonna be Africa themed.
It's gonna be what?
You heard exactly what I said. You heard exactly what I said, right? And then dealing with the dynamics of being very clear that in the richest city in the world, Black people were treated like garbage. Unless there was some other kind of value we could contribute to somebody else's thing. But even in our movements, like people were like, you cannot organize those people there. We were trying to build multiracial coalitions, movements, but Black people were never a part of those because we were considered to be unorganizable, which essentially meant we didn't go along with the program, right? So I say all that to say, underneath all of the flashy stuff that you see is a story of how people are shaped and how they get to a place. When I talk about how Black Lives Matter came to be, we could start the story at Trayvon Martin. Some people start that story at Ferguson. It really depends on where you position yourself in history. I could start it back to Bayview Hunters Point and watching people who lived in public housing have their homes be raided by the gang task force, these dudes who would show up in different color fatigues. And they would come as their own gang. and they would bust people's doors down and create havoc and be laughing the entire time. These are things that I have seen with my own eyes, right? And then gaslight you and tell you that's not what's happening, right? That is what shapes Black Lives Matter. What shapes Black Lives Matter is my experience of fighting with community, right, to try to get things that people deserved in a context where the only thing that people wanted to deliver was stuff for corporations and for people who were professional, who wanted to move in there into brand new shiny condos on the water, and being faced not with like white faces, right, but black faces being like, you people don't deserve to be here, right? That's what shapes Black Lives Matter. What shapes Black Lives Matter is my experience being in coalitions and being the only black queer woman in the coalition, and having to fight to be my full self 100% of the time, no matter what anybody said, thought, or felt about it. I like literally had to learn how to give 0 fucks, right? That is where Black Lives Matter comes from. But if you were to hear most of the people even in this room tell the story, they would say, well, it either started when Trayvon Martin was killed, or it started when Mike Brown was laying on the street for 4 hours. And I'm like, oh, it's so interesting. We each have our own stories, but those are also shaped, right? They're shaped by how we commodify Black struggle and how we elevate people who are doing work and people who are not doing work, right? And our level of discernment around who's who and what's what and for what. So I would imagine, right? So I actually don't come out of the criminal justice movement, right? So I would imagine that you must have a similar story, and I'd be curious to hear, does any of that resonate for you? Like, what's it like for you? And I asked you this upstairs, like, what's it like to go from a cage to this room? What's it like for you to be in rooms like this?
With cages around it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, this is part, so when I came home, within a month, I was already active. Literally a month. I didn't even have a real job yet. I was doing telemarketing, the worst thing. If anybody telemarketers, grace to you, but anyhow, that's what I was doing, right? And within, I paid my Metro card and some Dunkin' Donuts. So within a month, I was like working, organized around an organization that did work that at that time in 2010 was on the fringe of immigrant justice, right? They were organizing in the realms between immigrant justice and the criminal legal system, people who had that fusion. And so I was free in a sense, right? In a literal sense. I did 10 years, so I came home, I was free, thankful. But then there's this other introduction, not introduction, this is smooth segue into realizing that so many of the things that, like there's still cages around us, right? Not physical cages, obviously, but there's still cages around us. So I had to start using this terminology that I'm like free-ish.
Yeah, free-ish.
Right? But even within that, I think for folks who are within the criminal legal space who are formerly incarcerated activists or advocates or what have you, I think the question I struggle with, for me personally, is when do I get to accept or really experience freedom, right? And it's a different experience from people who have not, right? Who have not, who have not done time. Definitely as a black person in this country, I understand my space as a person that's free-ish, but also I also understand myself as a human being that was in a cage that's not there anymore. And it's specific to being in a literal cage that if you have not experienced it, you cannot understand it, period, full stop. So when do I get to celebrate that? So folks who are in the movement space, who are also formerly incarcerated folks, a couple years ago I had a project with a friend of mine, Piper Anderson, around, it was called like Spread Mass Love, right? What does love look like in the era of mass incarceration? And it was much more than just like intimacy in terms of like a romantic love. Like how are we able to really express freedom and notions of love after experiencing like that level of confinement, and now in another place of trying to free others and free ourselves from different forms of confinement that are invisible. And where's the grace in that? Like, when do you get to say that, when do you get to relish and say lay back and experience a modicum of freedom? And that's a heavy weight, because especially now when we have, you know, more people come home from prisons, great. There's a lot of advocates around the country who are doing that, some are in this room. But what will scholars determine about us 30, 40 years from now as a society? Like, how has society shifted, particularly in America, when we have incarcerated so many people who are connected to partners, who are connected to sons, who are connected to daughters and fathers and mothers? Like, how will, you know, we talk about this reckoning. One, we have not reckoned honestly in this country. Of course not. But it's sort of like we keep going further and further behind the scratch line. I don't know if we know what the starting line looks like. Are you talking about square one? I don't know. I question, like, what does the starting line look like? Because here's the starting line right here, but we way back there somewhere. And we keep compounding it with more things. So I don't know if we ever fully actualize freedom, even after we have, someone like me has been able to come home from actual physical confinement. But even in that same realm of in crime and criminalization, I want to sort of switch a little bit.
Let's go.
One of the people, organizer of the Square One Justice Lab, Bruce Western, yesterday he posed a question at the end of our conversation, of our roundtable, and it was this. And I'm curious how you feel about this. Understanding how we increasingly criminalize immigrants, right? Immigration is now somehow synonymous with criminal, right? In the larger national debate. Are there just notion, or can there be a just notion of criminalization?
No. I mean, this is a conversation I think we don't have honestly, which is there are bad things that happen that people do to other people. And you'll notice I said that in a certain way. Most of the time, we'll say things like there are criminal behaviors, which makes somebody a criminal. But it's really things that we have deemed as bad, harmful, right? That people do to each other. And we haven't, and by we, maybe I just mean me, I think I grapple with, what do you do when harm is done? And how do we deal with harm without having a whole system that then turns an action into who a person is? And, you know, I'm somebody who, and a lot of people don't know this about me, but my mother was a corrections officer. And she worked at San Quentin, she worked at Soledad before I was born, and she talked to me a lot about how dehumanizing not only that job was, but the way in which the carceral state literally dehumanizes people. And part of her job was to keep that going, meaning she was very clear that in order for her to survive every day, she was being asked not to see people's humanity. And part of what broke for her was that that's just not who she was. And that's not who we are. But because for so many generations, we have built a practice of attaching behaviors to inherent ways that people are, right? That we've learned in some ways how to amalgamate those things in such a way where for a lot of us, our muscles are very weak around being able to pull those things apart and say, there are actions that cause harm, and people commit those actions. That doesn't mean that the person, right, is inherently criminal or bad, okay? And as you know, there's all kinds of reasons why people commit harm. Some of those are intentional, some of those are not intentional. Under this system, it doesn't matter, right? So if like I'm walking down the street with you and you decide to do a thing because I'm with you, then I'm going down too, right? And it doesn't, like, I don't get to tell the story. Once we come into contact, nobody cares about what's the background. I was watching, I'm also writing. You're writing a book.
Yes, I am.
Hallelujah. I need this in my life. I am also writing. Book writing is the worst thing on the planet. I don't know why I agreed to do this thing.
How does it feel, though?
2 years in the making, I'm really like, I just want to be done. Just to keep it 100. But for one of my chapters, I was watching it was a congressional hearing on C-SPAN from the 90s. And I was
The good old days?
I was watching then Senator Joe Biden. And he was doing what we condemn the Clintons for, right? Like really going hard about super predators and we need to separate these people from society. And one of the things that he said that struck me was something to the tune of, we don't have time to figure out why they did it. The point is that they did it and we need to stop it. Because if we don't, that's a danger to your wife, that's a danger to your mother, that's a danger to your sister, that's a danger to your family. And I was sitting there and I was like, this is all learned. And that was so brilliant, the way that he delivered that, because literally, if I didn't know any better, I would be like, yeah, lock them all up, right? Because we're touching on a thing also that is on the flip side of harm, which is fear, yeah? And I think that I know that there has been a very intentional strategy to exploit the fear that people have of being harmed, which is a reasonable fear to some degree. But when that fear gets exploited to the point where we create whole industries around it, then you have to start asking yourself, right? Well, is it that there is an inordinate amount of harm that's happening, right? Or is it that we're actually just creating fear in order to kind of drive, right, these mechanisms of control and containment that we are profiting from? So I think that for me, when I am trying to pull these layers back, right? And I'm trying to figure out, what do we do with that? I too struggle with, well, what do you do when somebody is harmed? And I think those are the models that have not yet become as big as our conversation around incarceration. Like the conversation about how we get safe without creating categories that drive fear, but literally by dealing with, okay, if I walk over to you and I punch you in the face, what do we do about that? And then let's go up the ladder. If I come to your house and I slice your mother's throat, what do we do about that, right? In no way, shape, or form have we proven that isolating people, that attaching labels to people that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives, that punishment and retribution, we have not proven that that works. We have not done it.
Well, we're conditioned to believe that it is what it is.
100%. And part of it, right, like part of what and I call them our opposition, and some people disagree with that. They're like, we have to all figure out how to work together. I'm like, cool. There's a lot of people I want to work with. There's a lot of people I have to work with that I don't want to work with, but I know I need to work with them. There's also people that I'm like, we are completely on the opposite side, right? And to come together means to accept on some level those mechanisms that I just talked about. So when I say our opposition, I'm talking about those people. Like those people who are like, human beings can inherently be criminal, and they're not willing to budge on that. They are a part of a bigger strategy that has been developed over time. What they have done is not created any sort of vacuum for us to be able to fill with what else can you do. They've been so successful in their narrative of how we address harm that they don't leave any space for confusion. I think in our movement we do. I think we do. Whether it be on the abolitionist side of things, right? People are like, abolish the police. Number one thing people say is, well, then how do we deal with what happens when people aren't safe, when there's harm created, etc. And to be honest, and this is what like our elders, like Ruthie Gilmore and Angela and all these folks tell us, like, y'all, abolition is not just about how we dismantle. It's so much more about what are we presenting instead. And then those things have to go toe to toe. And people have to choose every day, well, do I want a world with more police? Or do I want a world where problems are actually getting dealt with, right? And we have to be able to do that so that there's no vacuum for our opposition to fill that creates the doubt around, is that really possible? That's how we go from free-ish to free-er.
But so you brought up abolition, and that's sort of a, it's becoming much less of a curse word now in some spaces. Is that a square one idea in the way that you just described it? Is that an idea in which before we can reimagine, we have to completely, we need to reimagine outside of anything that currently exists, which potentially means that we need to be able to see that these things are no longer there. Is that feasible? I believe it's feasible. I definitely do. But I'm interested in your thoughts there about that.
Listen, I think it is possible. I, in my lifetime, have had people tell me a lot of things aren't possible that have come to be. So yes, I am a deep, deep believer that many things are possible. But we have to have the will. We have to have the will. So.
And who's the we?
Us. So like, here's the thing, and we started to touch on this a little bit. I think sometimes maybe we're afraid of our own vision. And again, this is about shortcuts, integrity, right, and living our values. Sometimes we tell each other that to make progress, you have to compromise at every step along the way. And it's the way that you claw yourself to some imaginary space where there are no more compromises that you have to make, right? So, for example, when we start to reimagine safety, it often is never without law enforcement. And I'm curious about that.
I actually brought that up today among some law enforcement folks.
Yeah, I'm like really curious about that. Like, why do we assume that we need law enforcement rather than people who can solve problems? And I don't think they're the same, but we think they are. And in the dismantling of what we don't like, there's still things that we're like, well, I'm not totally sure that it's safe to not have this institution, because there are good people in there that are trying to figure it out and make it better. And I don't doubt that. Again, I'm telling you, my mother was a corrections officer. I get it. I have police and law enforcement in my family. And literally just 6 months ago, I was in Atlanta at our family reunion, and you know how it is when your family is hella proud of you. You know what I mean?
Even the law enforcement ones?
Yeah. So my uncle was like, family reunion's coming, we want you to be the keynote speaker. At my family reunion.
A family reunion? What's
so
your family like?
But it was us, you know what I mean? So I was like, okay. And so, I go, and it's like the Bogans, the Taylors, and the Buckhalters, and I'm like, this is crazy. What is happening right now? And so, I give my little talk, and they're like, Black Lives Matter, and some of them are in there like,
Oh.
damn, we related to her? Like, shit, right? And then afterwards, one of my relatives came up to me and he said, you know, that was a good speech you gave. But I think you have to remember, we need law enforcement. I'm a law enforcement officer. And I said, but why do we need law enforcement? That doesn't mean you're not valuable, you're not worthy, that you don't play a role, but is that the role you have to play?
Do you think, I mean...
Do you feel where I'm going with this? Like, is that the role you have to play? There's a question. And when you say that, people be like, oh, baby.
You don't know, you're naive.
There's no world without law enforcement. And I'm like, no, there is. There are like whole places, right, that don't have various forms of law enforcement. Whole entire places that don't have military, or if they have police, they're like tax collectors. They don't carry guns, right? And I know there's a whole thing where like, you don't know what we deal with, and there's all this stuff. Trust me, I get it. I think it's clear to me that there is the way that we have imagined what law enforcement is supposed to do and what it actually does. And that is attention for people who work inside of law enforcement. We are asking police officers to be counselors, therapists, mental health workers, etc. That is not what policing is designed to do, but because our opposition has completely dismantled any kind of social net where we meet needs, we pass that off. Just like we passed off problem solving to nonprofits rather than putting it inside the government. Oh, you don't want to talk about that? I mean, that's what it is, right? We like pass that off. We go, oh, that organization will deal with why people are poor in Deep East Oakland. But you don't give them no money
And a great tax write-off.
and no power to actually deal with the problem, right? I think it's the same with law enforcement. Like, if we're being honest, you could put 1 million more police officers on the streets and you would still have people killing each other, you would still have people robbing each other, you would still have people doing all the things that we say are criminal. Why? Because we're not actually meeting people's needs. And guns don't take care of that. Cages don't take care of that. And in fact, we've even started to strip out of, not started, we've continued to strip, right? All of the things that people need to like actualize their human dignity and to be actualized, we stripped all of that stuff out too. Because it's not about changing people's behavior. It's about control and containment, fundamentally, period. We can't argue that.
So, I mean, we're near the end of the conversation, and I'm sort of thinking about, like, we're thinking forward. So, I know you've created the Black Census, correct? Interviewed over 200,000 people from around, Black folks around the country. That was the goal. Could you envision that as something, or did you envision that, or could you envision that as a mechanism by which we can reimagine justice? And should it start, most provocative, should it start with Black folks?
Yeah. So.
Let me take a whiskey drink on that one.
Yeah, let that sit for a second. You know, let me tell you about the Black Futures Lab. Created it in 2017 as a mechanism to make Black people powerful in politics. After 2016, the election, and that horrible, horrible year of trying to figure out, as a visible person in a movement to be, how do we deal with this dynamic of democracy, non-democracy, right? As Black Lives Matter, how do we engage in this performance of democracy? And it was very hard on a lot of levels, because for good reason, lots of us know that elections are important, and also don't believe that they change anything. Yeah? Lots of us believe that government should solve problems, but don't trust people in government to solve problems, right? And something has to be done about that. And something has to be done about that in a conversation by Black people, with Black people, for Black people. And it's been really interesting building this project, because people be like, but you just work with Black people? Yeah. We do. We do. We are talking to Black folks. We are building the capacity of Black people to know and understand governance, to develop the solutions to the biggest challenges that we face in our society. And that is a conversation that Black folk need to have with each other. And we have a whole bunch of conversations that we are slated to discuss with each other, right? Like, we're not a monolith, and so there's lots of barriers and tensions and wedges and conflicts and all kinds of things amongst us. And I believe that we can't do it alone, but I think if Black people are not organized to some degree, we can't contribute to a broader movement, okay? So our first step, honestly, was to attempt a project that was aiming to try and talk to 200,000 Black people across the country about what we experience in our economy, in our democracy, and in our society. And we asked what Black people want to see for our futures. And I can tell you, we didn't get to 200,000. We got to 38,000. It's the largest survey of Black people that's been conducted in 154 years. Yeah? And what we heard every single time was, nobody has ever asked me what I want. Nobody has ever asked me what I think. Nobody has ever asked me what I want for my future. Nobody has ever asked me to envision who I could be 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. People tell me what I should think, what I should feel, who I should get down with, but nobody's ever asked me what's in here. And that should tell us something about the state of our political system. It should tell us something about the state of our democracy. And it should tell us something about the state of our movements, right? So we're releasing the responses next month. And we heard a lot of really interesting things. One thing we heard was that the overwhelming majority of our respondents had negative interactions with law enforcement before they were 18 years old. Another thing that we heard, this isn't rocket science, but another thing that we heard was that the way to deal with police violence in communities and improve, if such a thing can happen, right? Improve police-community relations is to hold police accountable for their behaviors in communities. Shocking, right? Another thing that we heard was that overwhelmingly, people who are having negative relationships or interactions with law enforcement in our respondents were men, people who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming, people who experienced poverty, people who had other experiences of discrimination in their lives. Yeah? These are the things that, like, we know, but we don't know because we've never actually invested in collecting empirical data about what it is that Black people are experiencing, right? We take texts from, you know, speeches from the last period of civil rights, and we go, you know, Black people have just really been holding it down for so long, but we're not talking to Black folks. So 47% of our respondents were from the South. We collected surveys inside of prisons and jails. We talked to people who were formerly incarcerated. We talked to people who lived in rural areas, people who lived in urban areas. We talked to people who were born inside the US and outside of the US. we really are trying to put some contours on how we understand who is Black in this country. And even with all those differences, and we talk to liberals and we talk to conservatives, and even with all those differences, there are a series of shared experiences that are completely undeniable. And I will say, we collected information in 28 states across the country. We trained 106 Black organizers to implement this survey, and we trained people in the tools of community organizing. So it wasn't one person or 10 people collecting this information, it was hundreds of people, right? And even with hundreds of people collecting data in different places, right, there's a lot of similarities in what people are saying we experience and what people are saying we want for our futures. So we're excited to release those responses and use that information to shape policy in cities and states, to shape an agenda by which we can understand and engage in politics. So it's no longer, you know, voting for someone on the strength of them being Black.
We never did that before.
No, not at all. But it's on the strength of being Black and having a vision for Black people.
Okay.
Okay. So that we are no longer voting for people on the basis of personality or whether or not I'd have you over for dinner, right? But it's literally about how are you imagining that you will not only solve problems, but how are you imagining how you will transform democracy so that more people can say, somebody asked me what I want to see and what I want for my future, and that is being reflected in the policies and the laws that are governing my life.
If you would please give a round of applause for Alicia Garza. So, do we have time for any questions? I know that it's a couple of minutes for some questions, so I guess Catherine has the microphone.
Yeah, and we'll actually, we have time just for maybe 2 or 3 questions. We're gonna bring a mic over. So if folks would like to ask a couple questions of our esteemed presenters, thank you all so, so much for allowing us to listen in on that conversation. It was really incredibly insightful and moving for all of us. I will invite you, if anybody does want to come ask a question. Also, I am reminded by our social media crew that you can also ask your questions and please share your thoughts at on this evening and tag at Square One Justice and join the conversation that way as well. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to bring to this? Yeah, come on up. You can. Is this on? Oh, you're next.
What's up, y'all? What's up, everybody in the room? My name is Clarence Ford, and I'm not here on behalf of no organization, although I belong to many, but I'm here as myself, as a person from the streets and formerly incarcerated, right? And I appreciate this talk, but as y'all are talking, I just had like this theme in my head that I was hearing, and like, can y'all provide insight on the threshold between being able to show up as your full, authentic self versus being professional? And I say that because, just to add some context, it's like, so last year I graduated from Berkeley, and I now work in an office space, right? And with a bunch of professional people, right? And I'm finding that, like, colonialism is real, right? And it's like, I kind of feel suffocated by it. So if I'm not able to talk how like, I'm finding myself code switching all the time. Like, if y'all had this talk, like y'all having this talking here at Impact Hub, right? Versus, like, if we was in the hood, like, the conversation would be completely different, right? But how do we get to that point? How do we get our coworkers or people in these spaces to understand that, like, it's okay to be yourself? Like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I mean, I don't know if y'all feel where I'm coming from with this one, but yeah, that's my question.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Congrats on the graduation too. You wanna?
We have to make it safe. So this was the first, what you just talked about was the first thing that we talked about when we got upstairs, right? Which was who else should be in this room, but also where should these conversations be happening where they're not. And the conversation about how we be our full selves, we have to create spaces where people can be their full selves, which means this room probably wouldn't be so quiet, right? There'd be like babies running around, acting up, you know what I mean, jumping on the stage, right? We'd probably have to have this conversation in many different languages, right? So more people could be a part of it. And it wouldn't be so structured, right? Like, if you had that question and it popped up in your head, you would be like, hey, but what about this? And we would stop what we were doing and then have this conversation. So that's a set of ways to make this more accessible. Let's talk about colonialism. Because we all chuckle, but it's real. Like, we're having a conversation, and I know in my mind, I'm not gonna speak for you, but I know in my mind, I'm like focused on you, but in my mind, I'm like, who is in this audience? Is this conversation gonna come back to me somewhere else? Right? In another space where I'm trying to get a grant for my work? You know what I mean? Or try to get into a space and talk to somebody because you got something I need to move my work forward. Is this gonna come around? I didn't like that thing you said. That happens. Literally happens. But also, there's something that happens to our psyche when we can't be who we are.
Absolutely.
And I know this brother from LA who told me he walked around like this for like his whole life. He has, like, literally his body structure changed. He's tall, big and black, like black. And he's walking around like this all the time. Why? Because he can't be anywhere without people being afraid of him. Your muscle structure changes, your bone structure changes if you're always contained, right? And so what did it mean for him to actually be able to walk around like this? And it's painful. It's painful for him to walk around with his head high and his shoulders back, because for so long he's been trying to shrink himself so people can feel comfortable around him without even knowing who he is, ever having spoken to him, etc. I don't think we take that seriously enough. And this is where our conversation comes in around this piece around square one, right? And how to have honest conversations and how to actually match our integrity with our values. And are we living those values all the time? Are we thinking about, right, what it means for you or me or you to be walking around in a space like this and in the back of your mind be thinking, I know for me, like, I try not to walk too close to people, right? Because I don't want somebody to accuse me of doing something, right? Like, we have these things that we've learned how to do that we don't verbalize, but we know them. We know them. See, I see people being like, right? So that's some of the stuff that has to be broken down, but to be honest, like, there's a thing that I have to unlearn about allowing myself to be my full self and accepting the risk. But then there's another conversation for those of us who never think about that. How do I learn that without burdening the person that's dealing with it all the time to teach it to me? It's a complicated thing. And when I say burden, I literally mean, it doesn't mean I don't want to have a conversation with you about what I'm experiencing, but where else do you learn about power and privilege than from the people who are experiencing certain dynamics and dimensions of it? That is a question I think our movement has not figured out yet. What do you think?
I'm going to be much more brief than that. I think what you're bringing up is a conversation around conformity also. And I have decided so much, I mean, I could say relatively recently, that like I don't have to conform to anybody's standards of professionalism. I think not everyone accepts that, and that's the risk, obviously. I should also say not everyone is in a position to take that risk. And that's being truthful. What I mean by that is, I often say, you know, I made a post a couple weeks ago on Facebook, but like, you know, I can say pretty much almost whatever the hell I want to say, right? But I also am not getting a 401k plan from some organization. I don't have a retirement plan. I don't have children that I support, right? That gives me a level of leeway and privilege to say things and be in certain spaces and be my full self that not everyone can. And that's not a knock on anyone who can't, right? We have their real responsibilities and real situations. But I think that to end with this point, I think it's a question I had posed earlier when we were speaking about what does justice look like for me, or what does justice look like for you, sir? And that's something we need to be able to find peace within ourselves. It's hard trying, physically, it's hard trying to conform to something that is not you. It is very hard. It weighs on you. Physically, it weighs on your health. It weighs on your stress. You think about why so many of us have these diseases, particularly people of color, all these heart diseases, et cetera. Like, we are literally stressed out by conformity and dying from it. And I think, like, being willing, if you're in a position to take those risks, but also being able to find what justice looks like for you. You're somebody who accomplished a hell of a lot. I'm using them the base. I'm just saying hella. Like you you know, if I was brother, like, you know, you did a lot, son. You accomplished a lot, and be proud of yourself for that, right? People should be able to just acknowledge you for that. Period. Full stop. I think I don't know if you have more. I know Rhea.
Oh yeah.
I remember her name.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rhea. I am a pediatrician who's working on a statewide project to use Medicaid funding to try to expand our behavioral health network so that providers like myself can refer kids to other services to help change their behaviors so they don't go in to the school to prison pipeline, or through what we call like the healthcare to prison pipeline, where we actively underserve certain communities' needs, which makes them more likely to act out in ways that get criminalized over time. And so I just wanted to ask, because sometimes in these conversations, and I try to come to these community conversations a lot, people say, like, we can talk about abolition of jails and divestment from police and think more about replacing them with counselors or with social workers or with healthcare providers. But as somebody who works on that side, we have great challenges. One, with the workforce shortage, like there just aren't enough of us, but also with our own kind of colonized ways of thinking about how you approach communities and problems. Like there's a reason why certain communities are underserved, and that's just as baked into healthcare as it is into policing. And so I was hoping you could speak to the fact that what you're trying to address in criminal justice and what Square One is valiantly taking on is really a problem that's at the root of a lot of our institutions. And I wonder if in your work you think about how we can uproot them in parallel, because if we're gonna turn from criminal justice, for example, to like healthcare, right? Like healthcare is built on the experimentation and extraction and exploitation of Black and brown bodies and indigenous bodies, so like we ain't got it right. So maybe you could speak to like how do we do that together?
Yeah, I'll try to go first. Yeah, thanks for that question. I often say now, I think when we have this conversation around criminal legal system, criminal justice system, criminal justice system is a subset of other societal issues. It's obviously a huge issue, particularly when you think about the amount of people that are caught up in the system, whether it be through actual incarceration, community supervision, immigration, prisons. Immigration detention is too nice of a word. Immigration, prison, or deportation. So yeah, it is a huge issue in that place. But one of the people that, in terms of my lineage, one of the people I bring up always is a person named Eddie Ellis, who was in New York State prisons and was a former Black Panther, falsely convicted, did 25 years, did a bunch of work. When in his years home, he passed away several years ago. He had this thing called and while there were him and some other people who were inside this particular facility in the early 90s, in New York, they wrote up this thing called a non-traditional approach to criminal and social justice. And one of the quotes, you should Google it, I really implore folks to look it up. You can Google it and find it. But one of the quotes that I always take out of it was that there are no prison problems, there are only community problems. And by that, of course, there are problems that are nuanced to prison. Of course, we know that, right? But he's literally saying that all the issues that we got going on in prison is what we got going on out here. In fact, that's why people come in here in the first place. So it's not only crime and criminality, but it's also our healthcare system. We understand that. We understand that the disparities in healthcare not only is intended, but we also understand the outcomes of it are some of the factors that lead people into some decisions that are harmful to themselves and obviously to other people. We can go to the educational system, and it doesn't have to be the school to prison pipeline. It could be the school to so many other things that are, so many inequities that are happening in school that they don't have to go to a jail to be the negative outcome. They could be walking the streets around among us that we walk by every day, and they're impacted by the inequitable access to proper education. So yes, I agree with you, Rhea, in that as we speak about issues of criminal justice and we think about square one, the square one problem should not only be focused on the criminal justice system, right? Because these are all feeders to the criminal justice system, right? I always say no one is born to go to prison. You don't look at a baby and say, well, wow, she's so cute. I could see in probably like 15 years or so she might end up, like no one does that, right? There's societal factors that happen to these folks that eventually lead them to make decisions that are harmful to them and others that can lead them to incarceration. I don't think we spend enough resources. I don't think our political analysis around criminal justice system has evolved to the point where we are always thinking about criminal justice, thinking about the issue, thinking about mass incarceration as a subset of larger social justice issues. We talk about it in some places, but I don't think our policies, our national conversation really look to that, right? So we can do something and say, we're gonna reduce the prison population by half or whatnot, which are good efforts. These are friends of mine, these are good things, I'm a part of it. But when you reduce the prison population by half, what happens? They go back to the same neighborhood, right? The kids still went to the same school that they went to. They're still in that chopped up hospital up the block. Right? They still got to go through that. They don't have access to go to the hospital, so they rather just deal with the illness, right? And see what, try to drink as much water as possible and drink tea, right? And hopefully it'll go away, whatever it may be. I think that there needs to be much more investment, much more conversation in our policy and our advocacy and activism, some are already doing it, around the feeders to the criminal justice system. Because if we think that we can just dismantle, decrease, absolve, abolish the criminal justice system and still have these other issues, then we'll just have another iteration that we don't know yet.
Yeah. Yeah. You can clap.
That was a lazy clap, right? I mean, if you're gonna do it, you might as well go for it.
I mean, it just strikes me that what we mean by having an intersectional approach. Like, people use intersectionality in these ways that I'm like, and the person who coined that, she's still alive, so she's not like rolling over in her grave.
The homie
Imagine
Kim Crenshaw.
being alive and seeing your creation be like decimated, right? It's a gift to us. It's exactly what you're saying, which is our society at large and all of our systems are racialized, gendered, colonized, right? And really built from extraction, exploitation, right? And being predatory. And so it is not that change is a destination that we reach. Everything, it's like an onion. Every layer we pull back, we're like, oh, but what about healthcare? It's not just that we need to have more, counselors or doctors or whatever if we're not dealing with the fact that the medical system is racialized and gendered and colonized and all the things. And I think it's also part of why we can't afford to keep saying things like good luck with your movement. And it's why we have to question how and why we are, this is exactly the point, how and why we are elevating, right? Elevating, but not actually like absorbing, okay? Like what do you bring, what do I bring that is actually not about us, okay? It's about a different way of approaching how we try to create the world that we deserve to live in. And it's a challenge to each of us not to be too comfortable basking in the glow of you being who you are or me being who I am, but actually taking those nuggets of like, what does it mean to make Black Lives Matter? How do we know? What does it mean to make Black Lives Matter in the medical system? What does it mean to make Black Lives Matter in the education system? What does it mean to bring those things together? And where do Black people fall through the cracks? Like, those are the questions that I know you have been putting forward for over a decade, that I have been putting forward for over 2 decades. This is why. And then we're just, I believe in fortune, but I also am like, what are these platforms for if we're not able to have these real conversations? And then what are you taking from it, right? And how do we get to a point where we say, the goal for us is to keep unlocking and keep pulling back those layers and keep seeing where else can we be useful and how else can we be innovative. Yeah? And those are the conversations that I feel like if we have integrity around having them in every aspect of our lives, we can actually get closer to the world that we deserve to live in. So thank you for bringing that forward.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. We have one more, I think.
One more question.
This is the Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn.
Yes,
right.
So, hello and thank you. My name is Dagmar. I'm here mostly as a visitor and an observer, but this is my question. I've been really thinking this evening, and while listening to you talk, I'm also touching on what your comments were a few minutes ago and what Square One looks like. So I work with young children. And my question to you is, as I've been listening to you speak, I'm thinking about Square One. And how do we speak to young children about this? Because I teach, work with really young children, and children are fearless. So many of the things that we're talking about, it's learned behavior. Because when you're young, you don't have these issues. You don't think about it this way, but you learn it. What would it look like if the way we deal with institutionalized racism and inequity and inequality was not reactive, but proactive? In order to do that, I think we need to learn how to have these conversations with young children, and I don't see that being done very much. And I think that kids, you see second graders, you know, we talk about kids in the cradle, but second graders, kindergartners on the playground, they don't care about anything. They care about their friends. You see people being affectionate with each other. By 5th, 6th, 7th grade, you are almost either taught to be entitled or to stay in your lane. How do we have these conversations so that there is no prison, school-to-prison pipeline, so that brown boys, which is most of the reason of why I went into education, know that there's another outcome, that education can be their way out. Or even if that's not the conversation that we're having, that children learn, children of color learn, children of different backgrounds learn, that their stories have value, that there is a space for them in the world, and that their narrative is just as meaningful as everybody else's. And I unfortunately don't see that being done very much. My question to you is, how do we start having those conversations with children?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. You want to go?
Well,
Thank you for your question.
thank you for that. Yeah, one, so young folks are already experiencing these things, right? I think the first thing we have to realize that they're already experiencing it, whether it be through some formal education in terms of somebody saying it to them, or they're observing it, whether what they watch on TV, now they are on the phone, internet, they're watching this stuff too, right? So they observe it. Even as, I like to say, even in the cartoon era, I look at cartoons I used to like when I was growing up, And I'm like, oh my God, look at the stuff I was learning from this, right? And it was so, it was innate. Not innate, it was insidious. I think one of the things is like we have to be able to serve as interrupters for our young folks, right? I think that if it's your own children or young people in your vicinity, or if you're your educator, right? I think there's a role of being an interrupter about some things that that they see, the informal ways in which they learn. Just recently, my little nephew, he's 7, and he has a lot of opinions at 7, right? And as he should, young black boy, he should. And he asked me the other day, it was something around Women's History Month, and he asked me, Uncle Marlon, why don't they have a Men's History Month, right? And I'm happy he's asking me this at 7, because he's thinking, right? And so I said, we need to have an interruption. This is a moment where I need to put down what I was doing, and we need to have a conversation around that, right? And I had the conversation with him. And not only did I have the conversation with him, like he doesn't live with me, he's my nephew. I saw him a couple of days later, and I said, hey, remember that conversation we had the other day? What was the reason why there's not a Men's History Month? And he even had a little bit more to get to me. I guess he must have looked online and found something else. I think, so that's the interpersonal way, right? This interpersonal way in which we can obviously do these interruptions, and it's our responsibility to do so. I think more so in a systemic way, our educational institutions in themselves do not create the spaces for educators to have these honest conversations with young folks. Now, there are wonderful people that we know who do that stuff on their own, but that is outside of regular curriculum time. You have to find time to do that, and in some cases you have to do it when they ain't watching, right? And it doesn't fulfill the educational requirements. So I think that's an advocacy conversation as well in terms of how to operationalize this conversation that I had with my nephew, even though that's just around, the issue of gender, really, that's really what that was, a conversation around gender at 7 years old. But how do we operationalize these things beyond just gender, obviously, issue of race, issues of, somebody spoke about this during our round table, but they learn at a very young age a mythological history of where they come from and where they're at, right? And that starts from kindergarten, right? And I think that's obviously another advocacy issue which some people are doing, are trying and fighting for. But yes, our young people are learning things at a young age, and I think it's our duty to do as much interruption as early as we possibly can, because as they get older, it'll be much more difficult to unlearn all the things they already picked up.
Yeah, all of that. I know folks are trying to wrap up, and I know the folks who are keeping the spot open are like, I'm trying to go home, it's a Friday, so let's make that happen.
Let's end it.
Thank you all for having us. It was really amazing.
Just expressing thanks again. We do have one more question that maybe we'll ask. The plea is that it's very quick, if you don't mind.
For sure.
Hey, I'm Noble. I have a question. I have an ideology that in order to make the best decision, you have to have the best information. So what do we do to teach the community how to think in law?
What's the last part?
How to think in law, because it's separate how we conduct ourselves socially and how we conduct ourselves in the law. Like when you go to law school, they can't teach you laws because laws change every year. They have to teach you how to think in law, how to create that narrative within law. So what are we doing to teach our community how to think in law? Like my understanding of contracts allows me a certain leverage. You can't tell me what to do unless I agree to that in terms and conditions through that contract. That goes throughout society. Even this was built on the back of a contract, this event right here. So what are we doing to teach the community how to think in law?
Appreciate that question.
You want to take it?
Yeah. It's a good question.
It's a good question. I actually feel like our biggest challenge right now is encouraging critical thinking. So it's not so much thinking in law, which I understand to be logic and right? Where logic meets a series of things that we've agreed to. Yeah, laws are different in different places, but what's underneath there, right, is a logic, and then consent, the things that we've all agreed that we're going to be doing with each other. And then there's all kinds of stuff that gets messy in there, which is where the logic becomes helpful to think about how do we solve that problem. I don't think we teach people how to think. I think we teach people how to regurgitate. I think we teach people how to parrot. I think we teach people how to conform. And that is a lot of the challenge that we face. I think it goes back to your question, and the thing I was going to say was, I think there has to be a strategy to education. And I wonder, from my own experience, you know, I went to a school and grew up in a community for a certain part of my life that was like mostly white. And so I understand blackness in a very different way, okay? And for a while, it was possible for all of us to be in the same space and not have an obvious conversation about how we were different. But then at a certain point, that becomes impossible. So the conversation becomes polite, but it's not logic, right? Or where logic meets an understanding of what we've consented to. And then there was this thing where I popped off at the mouth on Facebook, and then a thing happened, right? And people that I grew up with, right, from when we didn't have a sense of how different we were, or the language to talk about it, would say crazy things to me. Like, you people got your president. These are people, I went to your bar mitzvah. I ate your nasty food. How dare you? You people, we know each other for a long time. That's learned. Politeness is learned too. And once we figure out how to stop being polite, right? As they said on The Real World, that's when you start getting real. So when I ask the question about what is the strategy, like where are we making the interventions? I think it's like the conversation you're having with your nephew, which is really questioning why things are the way that they are. Mm-hmm. And doing so in such a way that we allow for the space to reimagine how we can be. So much of where we have the intervention conversations actually leaves the people who learn how to be powerful without tools to help, from their position, dismantle the thing that actually supports them being powerful in the world, right? So I'm like kind of sort of a fan of like anti-racist training for young people, except it has to be a certain kind. It can't be the kind that's like, you're bad because you're white. People do that, right? And then what ends up happening? We don't use the logic to question what we've consented to, so then we just become really polite and fake. Right? So we can say all the right things, and this is the Bay Area, so we are really good at this. Say all the right things, drive a hybrid, you recycle, you compost, you know what I'm saying? And when you're in the Whole Foods and there's a black person behind you with 3 kids who are yelling, you grabbing your purse. But then you tell yourself, that's messed up and I shouldn't do that, and then all of a sudden you're like a pile of guilt on the floor in Whole Foods. Right? So,
in Whole Foods.
In Whole Foods, otherwise known as Whole Paycheck.
Yeah, there you go.
I guess I'm just trying to make the point that we can talk, yes, we should intervene at a young age when, so that brave, bold, fearless, I don't know all the things that are wrong about the world yet, beings can be a little more free. And It's that combined with the tools of logic and critical thinking that allows people to say and do different. That's how we get young people now who are like having conversations about gender identity. I'm having lunch the other day and this baby was having a conversation with their grandma talking about trans and gender nonconforming and breaking it all the way down. And grandma was like, but baby, right? They were breaking it all the way down. I was like, wow, I wasn't doing that at 14. So it's happening, but we can still get sharper, right? And so how do we do that? And it's not a black and white thing, it's like a power and privilege thing. So how do we keep giving us the tools to understand how power and privilege works, and then to apply it to our own lives in any position that we're in? And how does that create space then for us to do different and not just like know it and hear? Because the way we get taught is to like regurgitate. And so we say all the right things, but we're not doing any different. Feel me? And that was for you as well.